She is often overshadowed by the antics of her son, King Henry VIII, but Elizabeth of York is remembered in history as the mother of the Tudor dynasty. She was the wife of King Henry VII, and their marriage brought an end to the civil war known as the Wars of the Roses, and united the warring houses of York and Lancaster under one. But Henry VII agreed to marry Elizabeth before the end of the war, and he did defeat Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth to take the crown for himself. However, their marriage, despite being one of unity, was one which was very important, and it would see the king and queen be devoted to each other. However, on the 11th of February 1503, Elizabeth of York tragically lost her life inside of the Tower of London shortly after giving birth. This left her husband, the king, distraught. But she was one of the first tragic people to die inside of the Tower, the same place that her son would slaughter two of his wives, one who was a queen. In 1502, the king and queen were expecting another child, and Elizabeth of York fell pregnant again. As was tradition at the time, Elizabeth entered her confinement inside the Tower of London, which was a royal palace and a favoured royal residence. It was the place where many kings would await their coronation, and it was not really a place associated with torture or execution, all that would later come in the Tudor period. But inside of her bedchambers, Elizabeth was to await the arrival of her child, and her room was decorated with bright symbols and tapestries to bring positivity to the birth of the royal child. However, on the 2nd of February 1503, this child would arrive, and Elizabeth gave birth to a daughter named Catherine, after her daughter-in-law, Catherine of Aragon, who had married Arthur Tudor and was now a widow. But tragically, after a few days, this child passed away from illness, and this sadly was too common an occurrence during the Tudor period, as around 50% of all children born would not make it past their 5th birthday. However, more tragedy struck the royal family, as 9 days after she had given birth to this daughter, Elizabeth of York was gravely ill, and she died from a postpartum infection. This was a heartbreaking loss for England and for the king, Henry VII, who was wrecked with anguish and heartbreak. His heart was shattered, and it was said that Henry VII departed to a solitary place, and would no man should resort unto him. He was utterly inconsolable, and many were shocked with how Henry dealt with this particularly, as he was a man who rarely displayed any emotion. But here the king was now sobbing his eyes out in front of his court. After Elizabeth's death, he retreated away, and he himself became rather ill, and only his mother, Margaret Beaufort, was allowed to care for him. He even sent the royal doctors away, but he did get better, and because of Elizabeth's death, the Tower of London became a place that was never really used as a royal residence again, as Henry VII could never return, as he would forever be reminded of his loss there. It became more of a place of imprisonment, execution and torture, but Henry VII then organised a huge funeral for Elizabeth of York. 2 members of his council took control of this, the Comptroller of the Household, Sir Richard Guildford, and also the Earl of Surrey, and Londoners even came together to help where they could. Bells tolled across London from all the churches, and Elizabeth's body following death was embalmed. She was dressed in her state robes and was laid out in bed. Her children were taken to see her body, and they blessed their mother goodbye, and when embalming was done, it was the sergeant of the chandlery who did this. He was given a number of materials for the job, and this included spices, balms, wines, and a lot of wax. Elizabeth had her body washed with wine and rose water, and various spices and balm were placed over it, and her body was wrapped in a cerecloth, and this had been cut into strips and was aimed to preserve the first Tudor queen almost like a mummy. Her entrails and also vital organs had been removed, but her body was then placed inside of a lead-lined coffin, and the wood was made from holly wood, and the coffin was once more wrapped in layers of black velvet cloth. Her coffin was then carried by high-ranking members of the nobility and was placed inside of the Tower's chapel. the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. Her ladies held effigies around the coffin and stayed with Elizabeth's remains until it was time for the funeral. 500 tall candles surrounded it, and the windows of the chapel were covered with black cloth. Elizabeth's sister then took her place by the body, and she stayed with the remains, and 6 ladies at all times kept a vigil. Her sister was Elizabeth's chief mourner, and the funeral procession then began on the 22nd of February. Elizabeth's coffin was then at midday placed on a carriage, and this was then drawn out of the Tower of London. The coffin was still covered with the black and blue cloth, and on top of it was a lifelike effigy of Elizabeth, dressed in her robes, and on top of her head was a crown. Her hair was down to her shoulders, and in her right hand the effigy carried a sceptre. The fingers of the effigy were covered with gold rings, and lots of people witnessed the procession of the dead, and it was the first time most had seen any slight image of what their queen looked like. Lots of London's public were involved in the procession, as 200 poor people carried torches and were dressed in black, and the king paid for this. There were also many other members of the Queen's household, and the Mayor of London behind, and Elizabeth's 4 sisters also followed in carriages. The Lady Mayoress of London had 37 virgins holding burning tapers, standing on Cheapside as a mark of respect, one for every year of the Queen's life. And the city's churches were draped in black mourning cloth. It was a huge celebration of mourning and of Elizabeth of York's life. The funeral procession then went towards St. Margaret's churchyard in Westminster, and the coffin was greeted by many bishops. It was then taken into Westminster Abbey, and there were further banners draped around the coffin. That evening the remains of Elizabeth of York stayed inside Westminster Abbey, and it was surrounded by torchbearers and other witnesses, and her sister Catherine then oversaw a supper of fish inside of the Queen's chambers. During dinner, knights and heralds watched over the body and continued to do this all night, and over 1,000 candles burned throughout the evening. On the last day of mourning this continued, and more masses were said for Elizabeth of York, and the Bishop of Lincoln gave the final requiem mass. Then women were taken up to the coffin to say their final goodbye to Elizabeth of York, and they gave a number of offerings. But then the final interment was made. The effigy of the Queen was taken from the coffin, and the Bishop of London blessed the grave of Elizabeth before the coffin was lowered into it. Her servants of her household, including her chamberlain and ushers, then snapped their ceremonial staves of office and threw these into the grave. But there was an issue, as building work on a huge royal mausoleum which began during Henry VII's reign and later became known as the Henry VII's Lady Chapel was not complete. Because of this, Elizabeth was buried in a vault made for her in the crossing of the abbey between the choir and the high altar. When the building work was finished, she was then exhumed and moved to the new large tomb that was made for her and Henry VII, and on this showed a huge effigy of her alongside the king. Henry VII spent a huge amount of money on his wife's funeral, and this was, in today's money, around £2 million. It was a memorable occasion for all of those who witnessed it, with the mother of the Tudor dynasty being laid to rest inside of Westminster Abbey. Everyone came together to witness her procession, regardless of their class, and Elizabeth of York is today remembered as a woman whose marriage united a nation and brought to end a civil war. Her death was one which was not expected, but it showed the dangers of childbirth during the 16th century, and this did not get any healthier in the decades after. She was the mother of King Henry VIII, the Tudor king who's most notoriously remembered for having 6 wives. But sadly, Elizabeth was the first Queen of England to die inside of the Tower of London, a place where Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, 2 of her daughters-in-law, lost their heads, but also where Lady Jane Grey died at the hands of her granddaughter, Bloody Mary I. Her death was one that united a nation in grief, but devastated her husband. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.